I'm going to go back to this. So the methodology that I'm showing you here is a 2D way of approaching things. And that's why everything is on odd numbers, right? In 2D animation, they discovered about 100 years ago that you could save half your budget by only drawing half the number of frames, because 24 frames per second means 24 drawings per second. But they figured out you could do 12 drawings per second and hold each drawing for 2 frames to create the 24. And it worked for almost everything except for really fast action. So 2D animation is always a mix of twos and ones. You hear animators talking about, am I animating on twos? Am I animating on ones? So ones means every frame there's a position. In 2D animation, we usually work every other frame. But in 3D, we work on ones, just like real life is on ones. So, but the timing I show here, it's the same approach as a 2D animated would work. And the timing does work out pretty good in 3D as well. Just because that way we don't have to worry about every single position. We're worrying about every other position. So the method that we're going to work on here to kind of figure out how to control this ball and get it to work properly, we're going to need to open up the graph editor. And that lives up under Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor. Okay, and I'm going to have that open here. So there's the graph editor. Now, the graph editor is showing me all the stuff that I've keyed in. And if you look at all these graphs, the two that I'm using the most, if I just look at the translate control, there's the up and down. So this is the up and down for the ball right now. And when you look at the graph, what you'll see is like bell-shaped curves. So this is the default way the computer calculates how to go from one key to another, as it connects everything with smooth curves, right? And when you're looking at a curve, when a curve is steep, right? So it's a really steep line, that means I'm changing a lot. The steeper the line, I'm changing a lot. So that means every frame I'm changing quite a bit. So this is translate Y, which is up and down. And when the curve flattens out, that means I'm changing very little. When it actually hits the flat part, that means I stop. I don't move anymore. So at the top of the curve, this kind of makes sense. I'm not moving very much. The spacing gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But the problem is the spacing gets biggest in the middle, and then it slows down. It slows down right here. And this is the exact opposite of reality, right? So we should be speeding up. So the default tangents that Maya is using to connect the keys are not helping us with this. So we're going to roll up our sleeves and do this manually first, and then I'll show you how we can use some of the tools in the graph editor to tackle the next bounce a little bit differently. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is looking at my planning. You can see that frame 11 here is supposed to be halfway between 1 and 13. That's the big gap. I want to protect that big gap. So I'll go back to Maya here. And I'm going to roll this over to frame 11. And it's very hard to know, am I exactly halfway? So I can flip and I can kind of make a guess, but the graph helps a little bit, because I can almost use the numbers and say, well, if that's 8, and this is like basically 1, then I basically have a difference of 7. Half of 7 is 3.5. So if I look at that and say, okay, 1 plus 3.5 would be about 4.5. Okay, I'm getting closer. I'm 5. About halfway, somewhere here is about halfway from here to here. I can just look at it visually. The other tool that we have to look at how something is moving through our scene is something called a motion trail. And what a motion trail does is it just keeps track of your object through space. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to go over here to modeling. I'm going to change this to animation. And that's going to change the menu setup here, right? So there are menu items that you don't see unless you switch between the different kind of production pipelines. So I'm going to switch this to animation. Then I'm going to make sure I'm only selecting just the blue navigation control here at the equator. I'm going to go to visualize, and it's this thing here, create editable motion trail. It's quite a mouthful, but when I click on this, what it will do is it will draw a graph in my scene. Let's push this off to the side over here. And it's basically tracking what this object is doing through space, right? If I change anything, if I go here and change this, the path will update. So I can go through here and I can sort of look at this and say, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. Now, when I look at this, it still doesn't look like a parabola. It still looks kind of like a triangle. It's not really looking great. But with the motion trail on, it gives me something more visual to actually see in space, as opposed to looking at a graph and then trying to figure out what my object's doing. So I love using motion trails. Now, the motion trails remain live, which means that they do cost you a little bit of performance. So I go to the outliner here. This is the motion trail. If you want to get rid of the motion trail, or if something goes wrong with the motion trail, you want to delete it, you just need to find it in the outliner and then highlight it and then hit the delete key, and it will get rid of the motion trail. And if I want to put it back, I just select the one thing that I want to track. Don't grab everything, because if you grab everything and then say create editable motion trail, then you'll get about 5 or 6 of these, right? Which is, we don't need, right? Not going to help you. And it's 3-dimensional, right? So you can see how things move in 3D space as opposed to a graph, which is 2-dimensional. So what I've done is I've just found a halfway point between 1 and 13. Now that I have this new position, I'm going to go to frame 9 and I'm going to put that one halfway between 1 and 11. So I'm going to keep cutting the distance in half as I go frame every 2 frames. So I did that here. That's halfway. I'll go to frame 9 and I'll grab my object and I'll lift that up, and I'm just sort of eyeballing that. See, it's about halfway. I can use the graph editor too and have a look at that and see how it's about halfway. Go another 2 frames over, about half, another 2 frames, and yep, about half, another 2 frames, and this is so close, right? I don't think I can do this justice. What I like to do is, instead of doing halves all the time, the very last one, I might make that, instead of a half, I might do a third, just to kind of really compress the spacing so it's really close together. And if you look at my graph, you can see here that, I'm just trying to eyeball things. If I look at this, that doesn't quite look like half. Maybe it should be a little bit further down. And then I would go and adjust every single one of these points to kind of reshape the curve to make it a little easier to kind of understand. Using this method, I just want to see how that changes the bounce. How does the bounce feel compared to before? Yeah. So same keyboard shortcuts as just navigating, right? So if I want to pan, Alt, right, and middle mouse button, Alt, middle mouse button, Alt, right button lets you zoom, right? Alt, right, lets you zoom. Same thing. The only thing you can't do in the graph editor is do like a 3D turn, because that would be kind of silly, right? It's like, what are you going to do with the graph looking at it in 3D? It's just like, it's still a graph. So that's up and down kind of taken care of. The other curve that someone mentioned is, well, what's going on with translate X? Well, translate X, this is going from left to right, across the screen. And the whole question you have to ask is, like, with up and down, it's pretty easy to understand where you should slow down. That's going up, I slow down. And where do I speed up? Going down, I speed up. So that's pretty easy to understand. But going across like this, the speed, there's some things you can kind of make assumptions about. If the ball is going the same speed, let's say you're just like a car on the highway going 80 kilometers an hour, no change, then what you would see in the graph is a straight line going from the left side of screen to the right side of screen. If you look at my graph, if I just look from that first bounce from frame 1 to 13, would you call that a straight line? Kind of a straight line, right? So there are parts of it that need to be adjusted, because again, what the Maya does is it tends to join curves with through points, so they get a bell curve. But we really want no sense of speeding up or slowing down going this way. The worst thing to do would be to have this thing slow down in the air, because it would feel like something was pushing against it. So if it slows down in midair, it then would feel like when people walk down the aisle at a wedding and they like start, stop, start, stop, right? It should just be constant, right? So just going at a certain speed. So the line can help you kind of track your eye, because I'm just guessing where these go, but I didn't really pay attention to this very much. The graph is telling me it's not a straight line. So one way I can fix that is I can grab the curve by clicking on it, and I can tell Maya, instead of using the auto tangents, to put it into straight lines. And then I can see that these straight lines, I can see, yeah, what I need to do is go here and delete these in between points. And then I could go back to where they were and hit S and S and here, right? And there every 2 frames. I could lock those positions in. So now I know that's moving on a very nice straight line. And you can see how that's evened out the spacing going left to right. So I let the computer do the work here because the computer is very good at dividing stuff into straight lines if you want it to. So all that I had to do was just look at where I start and where I hit the ground, right over here. And I deleted all the in-between points and then put everything into linear. So it's just going to go straight lines from point to point. And then I can go back every 2 frames and I can put the keys back by just hitting S, 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 S. So now I have everything nice and evenly spaced. For the rest of the animation, it's not looking perfectly straight. There's some kinks in the curve. So I have to go back and fix that later. But I'm just going to start with the one bounce just for now. I just want to get this working just to show everybody how that works. I showed one method where I put in a lot of points and then bounce up over here. I'm going to show another method to do the other bounce that involves fewer points. So you can see there's 2 ways to work, and they both have advantages and disadvantages. So if I look over here at this curve, right, and this one, they're very different. So one of the problems is that what should happen is very quickly, right, I should be going up really high, right? The first couple of frames, I should be bouncing up halfway. But if I had to hit S here, if I could just go like 2 frames later, this should be the halfway point. It's nowhere near as close. So the problem is that we're not lifting up fast enough. Okay. Now, in the previous method, what we were doing is we were putting in points, a lot of points to get control. Another way to do that is instead of using points is to work with the curves. So if you've ever used software like Adobe Illustrator or vector software like Flash or Adobe Animate, we can use the same kind of tools in the graph editor to change the way you connect the dots. Okay. So one of the things when you have a point and the handles is that when you grab a handle, you can use your middle mouse button and you can use a little teeter-totter. You can change the way the curve behaves, but it moves both handles at once. I can break that point by going up here and choosing this button, break tangents. So if I grab this point and then click break tangents, it looks like the letter V. What happens is you'll see now they look different. Instead of a solid line, it's a dashed line. And I can push this curve up and I can go to this side and I can push that curve up. And that kind of shape means that you're going to have a very abrupt change in direction. It's a very sharp curve. It's a very sharp change. Whereas before it was more of a smooth curve, which is where you're going to kind of slow down. So we'll see how that feels now. What we had before, right? You can see now I'm bouncing up a lot higher. And one of the things you'll notice is I made a change in the graph editor, but the motion trail, it looks like I didn't change anything. The motion trail is a live object, which means that unless you touch the scene, right, in the actual work window, it won't update. So if I go here and just tap and then hit undo, that's the only way the motion trail will update. So when you're editing in the graph editor, sometimes the changes you make won't be reflected in the motion trail until you go tap, do something and then hit undo to get back to it. So let's have a look and see, how does this feel? If I was to grab this point and instead of having it be like the change that I made here, if I just clicked on this flat tangents button, this one here, flat tangents, it would put it back to the way it was before. So you can sort of hit play and see how that feels, and then hit undo, and then look at that, right? So you can almost it's almost like going to the eye doctor. You can go like, okay, number 1, click, and I'm just let it play, and okay, and then undo, and then turn it back. So you can see before and after to get an idea whether or not you like the direction things are going. And one of the problems is leaning on the computer too much. If you let the computer do a lot of the work, it tends to get watery, there's less control. But something simple like this, I don't mind giving control to the computer. It's okay because I have control with this. But one of the problems of this method is, what if I want to change stuff like the timing? If I decide that this bounce is too slow, and I want to move this key closer, watch what happens to this curve. If I move this, look what happens to the curve. Does the curve stay the same or does it change? Over here, if I move one thing, look what happens to the rest of the curve. Minimal impact, right? Because everything else is locked in position. So that's why when you see me working a lot of the times, I'm hitting S and I'm keying everything all the time because I think like a 2D animator. I want to pose. I want it locked in, everything, translate, rotate, everything. I want it to be there because I asked it to be there. Over here, what we have is a very nice smooth curve. It's handling the spacing very well, but the problem is if it's too early in our blocking and we still want to change stuff, the danger is that, well, if I start retiming stuff, all this changes, all that changes. So you spend all this time working on the curves a little early. So it's usually not a case of this or that. It's usually both. So do I need to put keys every frame or every 2 frames? And the answer is, probably not. It just depends on the movement. If I look over here, I'm pretty sure I could probably delete these two and get away with just using the handles to kind of get that. I bet this one I don't need, and I could get almost the same curve. I need to be in charge of how big the spacing is going into the impact and out of the impact. That's my job. Otherwise, the computer will just make a guess and it'll probably be wrong. It won't be what I want. That's not that computer's bad. It's just using rules to connect the dots. It can't read my mind yet. So until that happens, it's stuck with me having to go back in and correct it. So this will do the job, but the disadvantage is that the in-betweens could change. If I make any change on this point, all those in-betweens are going to change. So what would I key? Well, I would probably want to key this point. I would want to key this to make sure I'm in control of getting this object to go up pretty high. And again, I could caricature this. I could say, well, let's really go up. Let's make that impact super strong, right? And that'll make it feel really snappy and bouncy. It'll feel very cartoony, right? So now it feels more like, again, you do this enough, it starts to feel almost like an animal or like a squirrel, right? Because now it's not just gravity, it's muscles, right? So what might not work for a ball could be perfect for a character because the character has muscles and muscles work differently than gravity. So that would be where you could play around. If I push this too high, what will happen? There we go. So if I go too far, all of a sudden the illusion is broken, right? And it feels like it kind of goes on a monorail. And if I put this too low, same problem. Doesn't feel like gravity anymore. So I know that this point is really important.